Hello, my AP Econ students. So we've got our Micro Unit 5 review today. Now, FYI, if you're watching this, so for this year's class, when I'm doing this, the class of 2020, you really only need to go up to the least cost combination rule. These are the only concepts that I did from this unit that are going to be on this particular exam. The rest of it, the College Board has said they're not going to test over, but I'm going to go over them because in case I use this video in future years when all the concepts are covered, it'll be a nice Unit 5 review. So if you're watching this year, you can stop at least cost. The rest of it you will not be accountable for, but in the future, those could be helpful to you. So let's start with factor markets and specifically demand for factors, which is the same as marginal revenue product or MRP. And so first of all, factor of production. Think of anything that you use in order to make a particular product. Usually it's going to be one of two things, either labor or some kind of machinery and equipment. Okay, so if I am making hamburgers, it's, I have to hire workers, to make the hamburgers. There's also going to be a certain amount of machinery and equipment that I use, ovens and stoves and, things like that. That'll help me make the hamburgers. So, demand for any kind of factor is going to be based on two things. In other words, how valuable is another worker to me or another piece of machinery or equipment? It's based on two things. Number one, how many units the factor can produce. So if I'm hiring you to be a part of my, say, pizza restaurant, I'm going to ask the question, how many pizzas can you make for me? Okay, based on how many pizzas you can make, that makes you either more or less valuable, right? If you can't make a lot of pizzas because you've never done it before, you're not as valuable to me as a worker who has a lot of experience in making pizzas and can make a lot of them. All right, so that's the first thing, is how many units the factor can produce. And then the second thing is, because it doesn't stop there, is how much is that product worth? Okay, the thing they're making, okay, in this case pizzas, how much does the pizza sell for? If the pizza sells for $1, then that worker that makes that pizza is not as valuable as a worker who makes a pizza that sells for, say, $20, right? So it's not just how many you make, but it's also how much it sells for. And so for that reason, sometimes you hear the term derived demand. That's an important phrase that'll often come up. And the idea is because the demand for any factor, whether, again, worker or piece of capital, is derived from those two things, okay? The other concept that we get from this that you probably hear even more often is what's called marginal revenue product, or MRP. Essentially, marginal revenue product is this: if I hire another worker or if I buy another piece of machinery, how much additional money is brought into my company as a result of that hire or purchase. Okay, so it's how much more money is brought in by hiring or purchasing another unit. Okay, so the formula for that, which is the same, MRP and demander, we're talking about the same thing. Okay, the formula is the same thing. It's how many units are produced times the price of the product. All right, so again, just to put some numbers to it. So again, let's say that I hire somebody and they make 5 pizzas for me. Okay, so that's the marginal product, the 5 pizzas. And let's say those 5 pizzas sell for $5 each. That means, as a company, by hiring that worker, I am $25 richer. Okay, $25 has been added to the revenue of my company because I hired that next worker. Now, as we're going to see in a moment when we look at factor markets, the question is, do I hire this worker? Well, it depends on what they cost me. And I'll tell you this, if they cost anything more than $25, I say, ain't hiring you, right? Because if I have to pay you $30, it doesn't make sense for me to pay $30 to get back $25, I lose money. If I can hire them for anything less than $25, I bring them on board, because anything less than $25 is going to be profit for me, right? So those two things are going to be basically that worker is worth, or that piece of machinery is worth $25 to me. If I pay more than that, not going to do it. Less than that, let's go ahead and make this happen. Now, obviously, mathematically, if either of these two numbers increases, okay, if my worker goes to pizza college and comes back and can now make, say, 20 pizzas an hour, okay, instead of 5 pizzas, well, they're more valuable to me, right? The demand for them, for that worker, has increased. Conversely, of course, if the other number changes, the price of the product, if that goes up as well, same thing, this number gets bigger, my demand for that worker also gets bigger, or piece of machinery, okay? So pretty simple, but just the idea of demand and MRP being the same thing, and basically derived from these two things, okay, which is up here, how many units the factory can produce and the price that they sell for. Now, let's look at, excuse me, there are two types of labor markets. There's perfectly competitive labor markets, and there's monopsonistic labor markets. Perfectly competitive labor market is essentially a market where there are a lot of businesses hiring a very similar type of labor, or labor with very similar skills. Probably an easy example would be like secretaries or administrative assistants, or whatever you want to call them nowadays, where how many businesses, say in Lexington, Kentucky, have that type of person on their staff, an administrative assistant or a secretary. There are probably hundreds, probably thousands of companies like that. How many people can perform secretarial tasks? Quite a few people, right? So that creates a situation where there's a lot of businesses hiring a very similar type of labor. And so, like a perfectly competitive market, we kind of have our side-by-sides going on here. On the left is the market with a regular old supply-demand graph, the supply of secretaries and the demand for secretaries. And if you notice, demand is downward sloping, both for the market and for the firm, primarily because of diminishing marginal returns. Remember, if I have one computer and one telephone, let's say, I can hire as many secretaries as I want, but with only one computer and one telephone, there are only so many things that they can do, only so many productive things for me to give them to do. So as I hire more, their value to me becomes less and less because I'm hiring more variable resources and adding them to fixed resources, okay? And so they become less valuable. So that's why demand is downward sloping. And again, over here, demand is the same as MRP. Now, the other trick, though, is supply. Now, for the firm, not for the market, regular old upward sloping supply curve in the market. Why upward sloping in supply? Pretty simple. If a very low wage rate is being offered, most people aren't going to get motivated to get off the couch or switch jobs or whatever else, right? So if I offer a low wage, or if there's a low wage being offered for this type of labor, not a lot of people are going to want to do it. As the wage goes up, guess what? More people are getting off the couch applying for those jobs. More people are willing to switch from their current job to this type of job, right? So it's a typical upward sloping supply curve. But for the firm, it's horizontal or perfectly elastic. And the reason is the firm essentially can hire, as if the going wage rate is WE, or let's say $20 or something like that, the firm can hire as many units of labor as they want at the same price. And so the supply is essentially elastic, and then that also equals the MRC, which is marginal resource cost. In other words, that's the additional cost of hiring another worker. So again, if $20 is the going wage for that type of labor, every time I hire another worker, I pay another $20. Hire another worker, another $20. Another worker, another $20, and that's why that's a constant or a horizontal line. And then, of course, if you remember our golden rule from our types of markets, MR equals MC, same idea, we're just adding a letter, MRP equals MRC. Essentially, up to this point, like I was saying a moment ago, as long as what the worker is bringing in, which is the MRP, as long as the amount of money they're bringing into your company is greater than what they're costing you, you keep hiring. Okay, you keep hiring. Okay? You're making profit off of all these workers up to this point. If I hired one additional worker, the cost would be greater than what they bring in, and I would be losing money. My profit would start to decline, and I stop at that point. So as long as the additional revenue they bring in is greater than the additional cost, you keep hiring. As soon as they flip, that's when you stop. Okay? So that's pretty simple. And then the other type of market is monopsonistic labor market, or monopsony. Monopsony is a scenario where there's essentially a single hirer of labor. If you want a job, you got to go to this company. Okay? So again, a lot of similarities between monopoly. Monopolies, there's a single provider of a good or a service. This is a single purchaser, or in this case, hirer of a good or a service, labor. So essentially, you've got a normal, because the monopsony is the market, You have your normal upward sloping supply curve. You still have a downward sloping demand MRP curve because of diminishing marginal returns. But the trick here is you'll notice the MRC, they're calling it marginal factor cost. That's the same thing. Sometimes I call it marginal resource cost. Sometimes you see it marginal factor cost, same thing. Anyway, is higher than the supply curve. Why is it higher than the supply curve? Well, remember, what does our supply curve tell us? If I want to hire another worker, I have to pay more money, right, to encourage workers to get off the couch or leave their jobs to come work for me. Now, if I hire a new worker and I pay them more money than I pay my existing workers, how do you think my existing workers are going to feel about that? That's right, they're not going to be too happy. They're going to say, look, I've been working for you for 3 years and the new guy's already making more money than me? I don't think so. Essentially, it's going to put you in a position where if I have to pay more money to hire the new worker, I'm probably going to have to give all my existing workers a raise as well. And so essentially the additional cost of hiring a new worker is not just what you're paying them, it's all the raises that you have to give the existing pool of workers, and that makes the additional cost of that next worker higher than or increase faster than the supply of labor. And that becomes our MRC curve. Now, we still apply our MRP equals MRC rule. Okay, so where do MRC and MRP intersect? Right here. And so that would tell us that I'm going to hire 10 workers. Now, remember in monopoly, okay, MR equals MC. Okay, that's easy. But what to find price, we had to go up to demand to find price. Well, here it's kind of the same concept but flipped. To find my price, I don't go straight over and say $20 is the going wage. I come down to $10, or come down to, my supply curve, which is $10. Now, why do you go down to the supply curve? Well, if you're a business, the question you have to ask yourself is this: how much do I have to offer in order to get 10 people to work for me? Because I want to hire 10 people. Well, according to my supply curve, $10 is the price that will entice 10 people to come work for you. And so that's what I'm going to pay. Now, you can pay $20 if you don't care about profit. We never assume that businesses don't care about profit. Now, some are altruistic and they will give, but we just make the assumption that businesses are going to try to maximize profit, and so therefore they're only going to pay essentially the going wage or what they have to, which in this case is determined by the supply curve. So you always come down to supply in order to find that wage rate. Again, I know it's really tempting to want to go straight over. Don't do that. Come down to supply. And of course, one of the reasons we don't like, as economists, monopsonies is because it creates all this pesky deadweight loss that we don't like. So essentially, if life were perfect, based on supply and demand, because that's in a perfect world, we always produce where supply equals demand. In a perfect world, we would hire 15 workers and pay them $15. Well, in this market, we're only hiring 10 workers and we're only paying them $10. So the problem with monopsony is they hire too few workers and they pay them too little. Okay, there really should be a greater amount hired at a greater wage rate. Okay, but because they have control of the market, they can essentially get away with that. Okay, so those are the main things I just went over there with monopsony. And then next, and this is the last part of our factor markets, is our fun little least cost combination rule. Again, I know it can be confusing. It's really not that bad. But the process here, and this is very similar, by the way, to what we did with utility maximization. If you remember the whole idea of how many pizzas versus how many tacos do I purchase, it's based on marginal utility per dollar. Similar concept here, except it's marginal product per dollar. The question is, how many workers do I hire versus how much capital do I invest in? That's essentially what it is, right? So how many so do I hire a lot of workers and then invest in a small amount of capital and have them do things by hand? Or do I invest in a lot of capital, big machinery or equipment, and then hire just a few workers to run it? There's a balance there that every business has to decide on. And so the profit maximization rule here, or sometimes called least cost combination rule, is the same idea as marginal utility, and that is the marginal product, okay, the additional amount of units the last worker produces, divided by, so per dollar, which means divided by the cost of the worker, should equal the marginal product per dollar, okay, the amount of the number of units the last piece of capital adds to your business divided by the cost of the capital. Those two amounts should be equal. So I kind of put it here as a summary. Marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor needs to equal the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. So an example of a company that's maximizing profits, they're hiring the right combination. The marginal product of the last worker is 20. So the last worker adds 20 units to your business. You pay them $10. If you look down here, so my formula, 20 divided by 10, and they're adding $2 to $2 in marginal product per dollar, okay, for labor. If you look at the marginal product of the last capital purchase, if the last piece of machinery I purchase brings in 500 units and it costs me 250, again, 500 divided by 250, and your marginal product per dollar is also 2. That's good news. That means you hired and bought the right amount of labor and capital. Okay, so that's good news. Now, they'll often give you scenarios where that's not all true and they have different numbers. So they'll usually give you, again, some numbers like I give you up here and have you figure it out, but I'm just going to cut to the chase and say, what if you were in a situation where the marginal product per dollar of the last worker is 5 and the marginal product per dollar of the last capital is 8? Now we have a problem because those two are not the same number, so you know you did not maximize profit or you didn't hire the least cost combination. In a situation like this, you always want more of whichever one is bigger and then less of whichever one is smaller. So the answer is going to be something like you should have purchased more capital because that is giving you a greater return per dollar, and hired fewer workers because that's giving you a lesser return per dollar. Okay, so that's typically how you do that. Okay, so you got to figure that out. The numbers should be equal. If they're not equal, whichever one is bigger is the one you do more of. Okay? All right, let's look at some other concepts. These last few concepts have more to do with the government getting involved in certain aspects of the economy. One is through the provision of public goods. So a public good typically has two characteristics to it. Number one, non-exclusivity. Non-exclusivity means that you pretty much can't stop people from using it. Once it's produced and provided, everybody gets to use it whether or not they've paid for it. Okay, so that's non-exclusivity. Number two is, non-rivalry, which essentially means we can all use it at the same time. My using it doesn't prevent you from using it as well. Now, most goods are not public goods. Most goods are private goods. You think about private goods, an example of a private good would be shoes. Okay, right now I'm wearing a pair of shoes. I bought them at, I think, Kohl's. And so if I bought them at Kohl's, if I wasn't willing to pay the price, Kohl's can say, you don't get our shoes. Okay, so there is exclusivity there. Okay, if I'm not going to pay it, I don't get it. The other thing is there's rivalry. Right now the shoes are on my feet. It'd be really hard for them to be on your feet at the same time. I can take them off and give them to you, but then I can't wear them. Okay, it's kind of where either I'm wearing it or you're wearing it. Now, public goods, they have non-exclusivity, non-rivalry. So good examples would be national defense. We're all kind of in the same boat. Whether or not you pay taxes, we're all protected from invasion by the Russians, okay, and nuclear war and things like that. Police protection, the same boat. Public art, if the government sanctions someone or commissions someone to build a statue in downtown Lexington, whether or not I pay taxes to Lexington, maybe I live here, maybe I don't, if I'm a visitor traveling through, I still get to see the statue. You can't stop me from seeing the statue. You can't somehow blind me because I haven't paid my taxes and I didn't pay for that. So it's non-exclusivity. Everyone gets to see it, no matter if they pay taxes or not. And if I'm looking at it, the person next to me can look at it at the same time. Or somebody can come by later and look at it as well. It's not going to be used up in a sense. And so public art, public parks, roads to some degree, so all these things are examples. Now, the big thing with public goods is the free market does not do a very good job of coordinating the production of public goods. And again, I don't say that often. I'm generally a free market guy, but the public goods are a little bit tricky because of what we call the free rider problem. And the problem here is pretty simple. Once people realize, I get this no matter what, you really can't stop them from getting it, and so they're not willing to pay anything. Okay, if you can't stop them from getting it no matter what, they're not going to pay, and if nobody pays, it doesn't happen. So it makes more sense and it's more efficient generally for the government to coordinate the provision of public goods by collecting taxes and building roads and highways, providing national defense, police protection, public parks, art, things like that, like those things that we talked about. Okay, so pretty simple, just those two key characteristics, make sure you know those. Next up are externalities, two types of externalities, positive and negative. Positive externality is a situation where someone engages in a behavior, but somebody else benefits. Okay, now it's not to say the person who engages in it doesn't benefit. They may receive some benefit. The key is they don't receive all of the benefit. Positive externality, the key here, it's a difference in benefits. Okay, and I always remember that because benefits are positive. We like benefits, so it's a positive externality. So an example that people often give would be inoculations and things like, if I get the polio vaccine I'm not going to get the polio virus, the polio disease. Maybe my family did not get the polio vaccine. They're benefiting from the fact that I did. Okay, because if I'm less likely to get it, they're less likely to get it. So anything where one person does something but other people receive some of the benefits. Now, the simplest way of understanding the problem with positive externalities is by looking at a graph. Okay, so you've got here, this blue line, this lower one represents the marginal private benefits. So these are the benefits that the individual receives from the action or from producing this good or service. The MSB is the marginal social benefit. Now remember, the society receives greater benefits than the individual. That's why that curve is higher. And then we just use MSC to represent the marginal social costs for, really in this case, we're just assuming they're the same one way or the other. Now, here's the problem with positive externalities. The individual looks at his or her benefits and says, based on my costs and benefits, I want to produce Q at a price of P. And society says, whoa, 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 that's no good. Based on our costs and benefits, we want you to produce Q1 at a price of P1. And so, in a sense, the problem is what we call under allocation. If the market is left to its own devices, individuals are going to produce too little at a price too low, and that's going to create this triangle up here, which is, guess what? That's right, dead weight loss. Okay, that's our dead weight loss, and we don't like that. So it makes sense for the government to come in and say, you know what? There are benefits that we would like to receive from this because there's good things about this, so we want to encourage you to do that more. One of the most common ways they encourage people to do it more is by offering a per unit subsidy. Remember, it's got to be per unit. Lump sums don't change behavior. Per unit subsidies do. So, by offering a per unit subsidy, they essentially say, look, if you're going to install energy efficient windows in your home, that's going to benefit you because you're going to have a lower energy bill. But we as a society, if we're using less electricity, we all benefit because there's going to be less pollution, less energy dependence, things like that. And so the government says, look, if you're going to install energy efficient windows, we're going to give you a nice little tax rebate or a tax credit for doing that, or if you buy an electric vehicle or things like this. And the goal is to increase the benefits for the individual so that his benefits match society's benefits, and we will buy more electric cars, we'll install more fuel, energy efficient windows, get more education or vaccines or inoculations, things like that. Okay, so that's the idea. So the primary fix is the per unit subsidy. Okay, so the problem, under allocation. Okay, the fix is a subsidy. Okay, paying people to do it encourages them to do more of it. On the other hand, you have a negative externality, same concept, except we're talking about not benefits but costs. Somebody engages in a behavior and other people pay the cost of that. Okay, so again, it's not that the individual doesn't pay the cost, but other people pay it as well. Okay, so good examples of negative externalities would be basically anything illegal, right? If I'm going to steal something, I'm stealing, but somebody else is paying the cost for that. Things like drinking and driving. Okay, I'm getting on the road. I'm not just putting myself at risk, though. I'm potentially putting other people at risk. Things like food fights in the cafeteria, right? I'm going to throw food. I may get food thrown back at me, but now you've got innocent people who have nothing to do with this that are getting splattered with spaghetti sauce and pudding and whatever else. Pollution, these are all good examples of negative externalities. And so the problem with negative externalities, this is a difference in costs. Remember, costs are negative, so that's an easy way of thinking about it. So the idea is the MPC represents the marginal private cost. Okay, so that's the cost for the individual. But remember, society's costs are higher. That's why the MSC, marginal social cost curve, is higher. Okay, so again, the problem here, just the way to read the graph, which is pretty simple, and that's not what I wanted. There we go. So the way to read the graph is pretty simple. The individual says, based on my cost curve, this lower one in my benefit curve, I want to produce Q units at a price of P. And society says, whoa, 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 that's not, we don't like that much pollution. We don't like that many food fights. We don't like that much whatever. Based on our cost, we want you to produce Q1 at a price of P1. So the problem here is markets tend to over-allocate. They tend to produce more than society really wants at a price that's too low. So the government wants to fix this, and the best way of fixing this, other than making it completely illegal, such as drunk driving and stealing and murder and whatever else, is sometimes they add a per unit tax. Okay, so every time you pollute, you pay a fine. Okay, that might discourage you from polluting because it's increasing the cost for you to engage in that activity, and ideally they increase it to such an extent that the individual's costs match society's costs and less of it will be done. So the best, again, the problem, over allocation, the best fix is a per unit tax, other than, like I say, just making them completely illegal, which they do at times as well. Okay, so that's our negative externality. All right, last couple concepts deal with taxes. Okay, first of all, this is just kind of a definition thing, types of taxes. The key to the three types, progressive, proportional, and regressive, is based on percentage. It's not amount paid. That will confuse you. It's always based on the percentage paid. Okay, so the definition is pretty simple. Progressive, the more a person makes, the more income they get, the higher percentage of their income they pay in taxes. That's called progressive. The best example of that would be like what we have, a graduated income tax system. We have brackets. As you go up into another bracket, you pay a higher percentage. Proportional, sometimes called the flat tax, everyone pays the same percent. This would be if we set up our income tax such that, say, everybody paid 10% of their income, whether you make $1,000 a year or $1 billion a year, everybody pays 10%. Now again, the person who makes $1 billion will pay more than the person who pays $1,000, but the percent is the same, so it's always based on percent. And then regressive is the opposite of progressive. It's where the more money you make, the lower percentage of your income you pay. And vice versa. If you make less, you pay a higher percentage of your income. You might think, well, why would the government set that up? Well, they don't do it intentionally, but there are some taxes that end up being this way. Sales tax, gas tax is a good example. So think about gas. Let's say you have a wealthy person and a poor person. Generally, they drive about the same amount every year. Well, if they're driving about the same amount every year, they're paying about the same amount in gas taxes. Now, if you pay the same amount, that's going to be a higher percentage of a poorer person's income and a lower percentage of a wealthier person's income. If they're both paying, say, $600 a year in gas taxes, okay, that would be an example. It would end up being regressive. Again, it's not deliberately set up that way, but it often ends up being that. All right, now, using that idea, and we're going to kind of jump into the couple ideas regarding inequality or income distribution. Okay, so there's two ways of measuring income distribution that you might see. One is what's called the Lorenz curve, which I've given an example of here. Lorenz curve and then the Gini coefficient. Those are two different ways of measuring income. So the Lorenz curve, the way it does it is it breaks the society up into percentage of the population based on usually household income, and usually it's in fifths or quintiles, and then proportion of income that those households have. So bottom line though, what you really need to know is this: if everybody made the same exact amount of money, this last year all the wages earned, everybody had the exact same amount, we would have a perfectly straight line. The lowest 20% of wage earners would get 20% of the income. The bottom 40% of wage earners would get 40% of the income, and so forth. That would be a perfectly straight line. Well, of course, we know not everyone makes the same amount of money, and so this line is going to be curved out, okay? Now, here's the key. since this is perfect income equality, and the curve represents income inequality, the more bowed out the curve is, the less equal we distribute income. Okay, so if the curve was, say, really close, like something like this, you'd say, well, they're not perfectly equal, because nobody is, but that's a pretty, the wealthy aren't that much richer than the poor. The more it's bowed out to the second line would indicate a situation where the wealthy have a lot more money than the poor, and so forth. And the more it bows out, the more unequal it gets. Okay, so that's kind of it's a visual way of seeing how society distributes income. And then the Gini coefficient is going to be a number. It's actually based on the Lorenz curve. It's going to be the area of A divided by the area of A plus B. Okay, you're not going to need to know the formula. It's very uncommon that they're going to do that. Bottom line is this, though. It's going to net you a number between 0 and 1. And here's how it works. 0 is perfect income equality. Okay, perfect income equality. Everyone makes the same amount of money. I always like to think of that as there is 0 inequality. Okay, everyone's exactly the same. There is 0 inequality. 1 represents perfect income inequality. Perfect income inequality would be a situation where one person literally owns all of the wealth, nobody else has anything. And I always think of that, that's pretty simple. I think of one person has it all. Okay, so 0 inequality, 1 person has it all. And of course, there's not going to be a 0 or a 1, it's going to be a number in between. But the lower the number, the more equal we distribute income. The higher the number, the closer it is toward 1, the more unequally we distribute income. And so you're going to get either the Lorenz curve representing that or this Gini coefficient, which gets you a number between 0 and 1. All right, and then lastly, tax incidence. Okay, tax incidence is referring to what proportion of an excise tax is a per unit, as a tax placed on a specific item, usually per unit. How much of that is paid by the consumer versus how much of that is paid by the producer. So here's a good example of a graph with some nice numbers on here and labeling and all that. So you've got the original supply and demand curve. So again, in a perfect world, we are going to produce 500 units at a price of $7, okay, based on the supply and demand for the market. The government, however, adds a $3 tax onto this unit. Now, how do we know it's $3? Well, they tell us up here. Even if they didn't put that number up there, we could still figure it out. And the easiest way of figuring it out would be to ask the question, okay, originally at $500, what was our supply curve? Our supply curve was at 7, okay? And now at the new, okay, well here they don't give us the number, so I guess it's a little bit trickier. But with the new one, this would be 10 if they gave us numbers. I'm kind of messing this up here, but bottom line is there's a $3 difference. You could use another point here. You could use, say, this point right here. Okay, at this point, at 300 units, supply is $6. Now your supply curve is at $9. This is $3 higher. Sorry, I should have used that. Sometimes they give you that number up there. But here it's $3 higher. So it's a $3 tax. You could figure that out even without the number. Anyway, so now, just to figure out some of the little areas here, what is with the after the tax, what is consumer surplus? Well, always remember the formula for consumer surplus. It's the area above price, which is now $9, below demand, which is right here, and to the left of quantity purchased, which is 300. So essentially, area R represents consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the area below price. Now here's the trick. Yes, the price is $9, but does the company get to keep all $9? No, they have to send 3 of those dollars off to the government. So you get $9, you send off 3 to the government. How much do you really get to keep? And the answer is $6. So when you say producer surplus is the area below price, we're talking about the price that they actually receive, okay, which is now here at $6. So $6 is the price. So what's producer surplus below price, above supply, and to the left of quantity, which is 300. And so area W is going to be our producer surplus, okay? Then you've got the proportion of tax paid by the consumer, And the easiest way of doing it, it's going to be this upper box right here, okay, which is S. And the easiest way of thinking about this is this. What was the original price paid by the consumer? Before the tax happened, the consumer paid $7. Now how much does the consumer pay? They pay $9. So the consumer, of the $3 tax, consumers are paying for 2 of those $3. Okay, so essentially this blue box, the S, represents the consumer's portion of the tax. Here, remember, originally before the tax, the producer got $7. Now, like I said a moment ago, the producer only gets $6. So this box here, which is letter T, represents the producer's burden of the tax. In other words, of the $3, the producers are paying 1 of those dollars. So the breakdown here is, and you can see this visually, the S box is bigger than the T box. Okay, the consumer is paying more of the tax burden. They're paying, of the $3, the consumer pays 2, the producer pays 1. And you can see that in that the S box is bigger than the T box. And of course, the one thing that we definitely don't like about this is the old deadweight loss, okay, which is represented by this triangle here, U and V, okay? So if they ask you to label, again, R, consumer surplus, W, producer surplus, S plus T is the total area of tax received by the government. Okay, to break it down further, S is the portion the consumers are paying, T is the proportion producers are paying. But S and T are the total area. Now sometimes they give you the numbers, and here we have numbers we can use. So how would you, if they asked you to calculate the total amount of money this tax brings into the government, it would be the amount of the tax, which is $3, okay, which is right here, 9 minus 6 is 3, and the number of units sold, which is 300. In other words, what is the area of this square, S and T, or rectangle, S and T, and it's 3 times 300, so the government is bringing in $900. And I do the math down here for you, right here. Okay, so $900 is how much the government brings in. All right, and then my blue box there, UV, that is our deadweight loss. So that's how you would label this type of graph. And then the last thing is just a quick summary, a chart that I've given you that illustrates, based on elasticity, who pays more of the burden. Well, tax incidence, which is based on elasticity, if demand is elastic, the producer pays more of it. Okay, and you could explain that in the sense that if you raise the price, none of your customers stop buying it. Well, in a situation like that, that basically means that if I raise my price and nobody buys it, I can't really raise my price. And so me, as the producer, I'm absorbing all of that tax burden, right? I'm having to pay it all because I can't really pass it on to my consumers because they leave. On the other hand, if demand is inelastic, okay, if I can raise the price and people are still going to buy it, I'm just going to go ahead and raise it by the price of the tax, and so the consumer bears most of that burden. And then when it's supply, they're both flip-flopped, okay? So when supply is elastic, it's the consumer. Supply is inelastic, it's the producer, okay? So that's an easy way of kind of going back and forth there. All right, so again, hopefully that helps cover some of those concepts. And again, you got some examples and some nice graphs that I found that illustrate that. But as always, if you have any questions, let me know. And of course, till next time, stay healthy and happy.